Hey JavaScript LA. So in this video we're going to talk about the reduce function. And the reduce function is really useful for taking an array of values and basically condensing it down into one singular value. It's really useful especially if you're working with an array of large amount of numbers or maybe a large amount of objects and you want to kind of get the property for one particular object and then condense all of them down into a single value. So this is another one of those questions that get asked at coding interviews. What is the reduce function? How do you use it? And then why would you use it? So we already covered sort of the why. It's to help kind of condense down lots of values into a singular value. It's really handy. And now we just kind of need to know how to use the function. So I'm going to show you first MDN, which is, as we know in some of the other videos, this is a very handy site. Basically, it has documentation on pretty much all the JavaScript objects and different global objects that are out there. So array is one of them. Basically, array has a whole bunch of built-in methods, such as for each, as we saw, as well as map. There's also push and pop, as you've heard before, probably in your web developer life. And then there's also the reduce function, which we're looking at right now here. So let's take a look at what their example is before we dive into our own example. So they also have an array, and this array has 4 values. And basically the main thing to take a look at here are the 2 variables. We have an array, and then we have a reducer, and then basically on our array, which is array 1, we're saying reduce, right? This is the method, that's the method name. Reduce this function, right? And so this function is called reducer. So this could be a little confusing because they're both kind of similar in name, but what you want to kind of take away from here is just like our other examples, like for each, map, filter, anytime we use these built-in methods, the common paradigm with the 4 ones that we've been looking at, this one included in that, is that there's a callback function, right? When we started that for each function, we had to take a callback function with that for each. It's a higher order function, and then basically that function gets called every time we run our internally buried loop. So that's, you can think that's kind of the same thing going on here. There's a loop, it's iterating through each value in the array, and every time we're going through the array, we're calling this reducer function, right? Don't get hung up by the word, but we're actually calling this callback function. Now that we know that, we need to think about what exactly is going on in this callback function. So here you can see that you have accumulator and then you have a current value, and these are basically 2 parameters. So 2 parameters to our function, and this is written in ES6. And then on the right hand side we have our function body, and because there are no brackets, then you can just assume that this is the return value. So you would think somebody would basically pass in some sort of accumulator and a current value, and then basically they would add to their accumulator the current value. So that's kind of the idea that's going on here. We'll touch on that pretty soon. But basically you might also be wondering, what is an accumulator? Like, that's a big word. I've never heard of that before. So accumulator is just the big fancy way of saying total. And so essentially, if you look at this array, right, there's a 1, there's a 2, there's a 3, and there's a 4. And so this accumulator is going to keep track and accumulate each value. And so we're going to add 1, we're going to add 2, we're going to add 3, we're going to add 4. And basically, it's also, with this particular function, right, reduce, you can configure what the initial value is. So let's say that, you know, your accumulator doesn't have, right, like in this particular example, there is no initial value. Your accumulator by default with the JavaScript function here is going to use the first element in the array. So that's by default. Now if you do supply an initial value, as you can see here in this particular part of the function syntax, if you do supply it, well then that will become the initial value. And so you can see in the second example here that if we provide 5, 5 becomes the first value to the accumulator, then 1, then 2, then 3, and 4 get added, and so on. So that's happening every iteration of the loop. So, you with me so far? basically it's a little bit more complicated than the other functions we have been looking at so far, but if you've been following along, you've sort of been building up to this moment, right? Because each of those functions do something with a loop, it buries the loop, and it calls back a function, and then it gives you back some sort of output. So in our map function, we got back a new mapped array. In our filter function, we got back a new filtered function that passed a truth test. In the reduce, we're basically getting back a value, and that value is going to be this accumulator that keeps track of all the different values in our array. So hope that makes sense. So now that we know that, let's go ahead and basically write this out ourselves here. I actually wrote this out before I made this video, but I'll go ahead and clear this out, and we'll just go ahead and write it from scratch. So here I have, I need a result variable first off, because I want to be able to console log it. And then I'm going to take my numbers array, and I want to call the reduce method on it. This is a built-in method, as we talked about. And then we need a callback function. So I'm just going to say accumulator, right, just like we saw, and then current value. And then basically I just want to return the accumulator plus the current value. So we're just reviewing here what we saw. And then we're going to console log the result. So save that, and then basically, as I mentioned before, I'm using Node.js, and so if you don't have Node.js, what you'd want to do is you'd want to install it, and it's pretty easy to do. You can just go to nodejs.org, and then basically if you have a Mac or Windows or even Linux, you just download the version that they recommend for you. So I recommend this 12.18. Once you do that, and once you install it on your computer, then basically you can come back over to your console, your command line, and then as long as you're writing in some file that you know how to navigate to on your computer, you can just go there and then type node index.js. That's the name of this file, and then the key here is the node. So if you have to install it in order to do this. So once you do that, you can see that because I have a console log statement, this gets logged to my console here, which is 150, and that's correct. So here we see how to use the reduce function. Now, the interviewer might ask you, well, that's great and all, but can you write this from scratch? And so that's where it gets more tricky. So for this second part of the video, you need to pay more attention, right? Because it's going to be a little bit more involved. So the first thing we need to do is we need to comment out all these values that we're never going to use again. And we're going to write our own reduce function. And so let's start off by creating a simple variable, and we'll call it reduce. And because we're using a variable, we're going to use function expression syntax by basically declaring a function and then saving it inside this variable. So remember, anytime you create a function body, that gets added to this variable, and then you use the variable like a function later on when you call it. So here I'm going to say, all right, in my reduce function, because I don't have this array, right, and because this is my own custom method, I need to basically pass in my array. That's got to be the first parameter because I'm not using it in this manner. So I need access to an array, and then I also need a callback function. And this callback function is what is going to be used every time we loop through our array, right? Just like we saw with the for each, or just like we saw with the map when we were writing those things from scratch. This is the same idea, same principle. Now, if you notice, we also had this initial value here. So let's go ahead and add that to our list of parameters. So we'll say initial value. And I need to be careful sometimes because I misspell initial. So, now that I've got the initial value, the function, and the array, I got to remember, okay, if they supply an initial value, then I want to use that initial value, right? But if they don't have that initial value, then what I'd like to do is basically use the first item in the array, just like they've said in the documentation. That's kind of how I want to build this up. So the other thing too is that we need some kind of total, something to keep track of the numbers every time every time we traverse the array. And then we're going to add that value to our running total, and then we're going to return back the total. That's the concept anyway with this particular program, right? If you want to make a reduce function, The reduce function has to keep track of all the numbers and then return the total number. So that's what we need to do here. So just for convenience, we'll go ahead and write total. And then basically here, if there is an initial value, right, and this is where it's meant I have to be careful with the spelling, then what we want to do is use the initial value, right? Okay, so if they supplied it, use the initial value. Else, what we want to do here is say, okay, well, they didn't supply an initial value, so what we need to do here instead is use the first item in the array. So that's what we're going to do here. Now, the next thing you need to do is loop through this array and then call the callback function, because the callback function is where the magic happens, right? So as you can see here in our commented out example, we have this callback function, and basically every time we traverse through the array, right, this array, we're basically getting access to the current value as well as the accumulator, right? And we need to add the current value to this accumulator and then return that with this function to our total. That's kind of like what's actually going on. And so we need to write a for loop, essentially. That if we don't have the for loop, then we're not going to be able to loop through the array. So that's actually the next step. So we're going to create the for loop. Now, because this is a little bit trickier, what we need to do is we need to declare I outside of the for loop. So I'm just going to have a I variable here, my counter if you want. And basically here I'm going to say, all right, if they supplied an initial value, we want to set I to 0. Otherwise, we want to set I to equal 1, right? Because we're saying, okay, use the first item in the array. So because I lives outside of the for loop, we can just skip the initialization in our for loop and go on to I less than the array.length. Okay, so that's where it gets a little tricky. Some people have never seen this syntax before, but that's okay. You can do these kind of things in JavaScript. All right, so next we need to add to our total, right? Because right now total is just either one of these values. It's initial value or it's the first item in the array. And because we already kind of checked out what I should be, that's going to dictate how many times this loop runs. So then remember, the callback function is where the magic is happening. So the callback function is going to return something to our array. And so it's going to return back the current total, right? And then the current item in the array. So total maps over to accumulator, and then array of I maps over to current value. Okay, so then finally we return our total. So let's take it from the top one more time, just because this could look a little confusing. In order to write our reduce function from scratch, we need access to our array. Now we could write our own reduce function that lives on top of this numbers, and it could be on an array. We could define it just like the prototype here if we want, but I decided to just keep it simple for now. Instead, we're just going to take in an array, and then we need a callback function, and because we want to support an initial value, we have the initial value here. So that's why we have these 3 parameters. Then inside our reduce function, we need access to 2 things, a total, and then we need an I initialization counter, right? So some sort of value. And basically the main part to look at with this if-else statement is the initial value provided for us? Because if it's not, then we want to just basically use the first item in the array. And if the initial value is provided to us, then we want to just use that initial value. So this is kind of like where the magic happens, right? So one of the magic things. I've been saying magic so many times. Basically, so if they have an initial value, then we want to use that. If they don't, then we're just going to use the first item in the array. And because the for loop is going to run different times based on what we have in our if-else statement, we want to set I equals 0 or 1. So I equals 0 if they provide an initial value. Otherwise, I equals 1 if they provided no initial value. And so then here we can skip the initialization and just go on to the next part of the comparison and then do the increment And then basically every time we go through the loop, we just want to call back our function, right? This particular function here in the use case. And then we want to add to our total the current value in our array, and then pass it back to our total, which exists inside this function. And so it's going to keep track, almost like a closured total. It's going to keep track of all the different totals that it gets back from here, and then return it for us. So hope that made sense. Let's go ahead and use this function now. So I'm going to create another variable called res, and I'm just going to call it the reduce function we just wrote. And we're going to take in our numbers array, and then basically we're going to use the same accumulator that we defined up here. And let's just go ahead and copy that. And basically, I think I had one extra parameter in there, or parentheses in there. So let's go ahead and see what happens first. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then console log the result, and save. And then I'm going to go over here and just type node index.js, and it looks like I have one error. R is not defined, and that's because I wrote array. So keep track of your variable names. So go ahead and do it again, node index.js, and we get back 150. Looking pretty good. That's exactly what we would expect. Now one more thing is to check the initial value, right? So let's go ahead and put 5. And this time what I want to do is I want to use the MDN example. So I'm going to go ahead and take the same array that they had, change numbers to just be this, save that, and go ahead and run this one more time. We should see as our output from here 15. So let's go ahead and do that. Node index.js, and be careful when you press tab, because you might complete the files down here. It'll show you all your files in your current folder. So you just want to type node index.js, or whatever the file name is you called it. So we get back 15. We're good to go. We know how to use the reduce function. We know how to write it from scratch, and we know why we would even use it in the first place. So with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.